Hello everyone and welcome to this video on outsourcing and offshoring. These two concepts are particularly important whenever we look at any kind of organization or business today. They're very common, they are interrelated, but they are distinct. So we're going to be defining them and then looking at a matrix to see how they interact, as well as looking at the factors involved in making outsourcing and offshoring decisions. So if we start just by looking at definitions of both, so outsourcing is a concept which has become very, very common, and it's effectively the performance of an activity or business function by an outside third party. So you can outsource pretty much any activity or function within an organization. So if you think about an accountant, so accountancy is a business function. It can traditionally be performed by the organization itself. But if you were to hire an outside accounting firm, you're not actually bringing them inside of your company or organization. You're actually taking that activity, the preparation of yearly accounts typically, and that's being done by an external third party. So you've outsourced your accounting function. You can outsource manufacturing. So manufacturing outsourcing is a particular area of business study itself, where your physical goods are manufactured by a third party according to your design and overseen by yourself. But you also have business process outsourcing, where pretty much any business process or activity can be outsourced. So this can be things like HR. So you can have your HR function, which is typically used to hire, fire, and train staff, and this can be done by an external HR consulting firm. So you give them instructions on the kind of job spec you have, and they can go and source you the staff you need, conduct interviews, and so on, have the onboarding procedure, and all the other activities that are traditionally performed by your own HR employees. Even management itself can be outsourced. That may sound a little odd, but you have examples of this in construction, where a company may be responsible for producing a particular building, but they've hired a construction management firm outside of themselves, so a third-party construction management firm, to actually manage the various inputs, contractors, and so on that go into producing that output, producing that building itself. So absolutely any activity or business function can be outsourced. It is something which is not just restricted to manufacturing outsourcing, which is the type of outsourcing that we usually think of. So that's outsourcing. Our definition of offshoring here is, again, the performance of an activity or business function, but here outside of a country of usual operation. Now, if you're a domestic company, then this would be outside of your home country. So if you're a company or organization which just operates primarily in a single country, then any kind of activity which is performed outside of that country would be offshored. But if you're an international business and you operate across multiple different countries, across borders, then you can still offshore activities if it's outside of a country where you usually operate. Offshoring may seem like an odd term, but it's related to, really originates in the UK. The UK is an island. The only hard border that we have is really with the Republic of Ireland. Aside from that, anything outside of the UK, which isn't in Ireland, would be offshore. So the term originates from the UK, but it would refer to anything outside of your country of operations, national borders. So if you were a German company and you were operating just in Germany, and then you took an activity or a function and you placed it in France, even though that's a land border, we would still refer that as being offshored or taking place outside of Germany itself. Now, we did say that these were two interrelated concepts, even though they are distinct concepts. So we are going to look at a matrix of how they interact with each other. But we have two questions that really help us understand the relationship. So the first question that you would ask is, there's a focal operation, which would be your own first party operation, so the operation of the organization we're discussing. Do they own the assets involved? Is it their own assets, or is this contracted with a third party? So you can either own the assets or you don't own the assets involved in the operation or the activity we're discussing. And secondly, are the assets located in a country of usual operation? So are they in a country that you have other operations, ongoing operations in? So we can refer to that as either domestic or international operations. So we can take these four possible answers and place them in a matrix form to get an outsourcing offshoring matrix, where we can take any four combination of answers and we have an understanding of exactly what kind of outsourcing / offshoring arrangements are in place. If we start with two answers, that we own the assets and they are in a country of existing operation, we get domestic operations. So here, our own operation owns the assets, we perform the activities ourselves, we own the process or the function that we're discussing, and it takes place within the country of usual operation. So we just refer to this as domestic operations. So that's nice and straightforward. If we were to switch the answer along the bottom axis to international, so now we're taking this business function or activity outside of our country of normal operation, we have offshore operations. So the organization, the focal operation, still directly manages and owns the operation or function. It's simply being done outside of the country of normal operation, so it's being done overseas or outside of the country's borders. So we would refer to this as offshore operations. If you were to go to a domestic operation, so within our own borders of countries of regular operation, but we don't own the assets, that would be outsourcing. Or sometimes also referred to as domestic outsourcing. So we would have another organization, a third party, actually performing the activity or the business function, but within the same country. So within the country of normal operation, we just refer to this as usually simple outsourcing. If we were to still not own the assets, but actually the activity or business function is performed outside of our normal country of origin or country of operation, then this would be offshore outsourcing. So we would be outsourcing the activity because it's being performed by a third party, but it would still be offshore because it's not within our usual countries of operation or country of operation. So it would be both offshoring and outsourcing. So it would be offshore outsourcing. So here the point and the value of having a matrix representation like this really is to make sure we understand the distinction between outsourcing and offshoring, but also how they can combine in various ways. There is cost reasons for both, but they both come with some problematic issues depending on the circumstances. So the traditional way organizations have operated, and we are talking 30-40 years ago, domestic operations was the default. So if you had an activity or a business function that needed to be carried out, there would be a presumption that you are talking about domestic operations. We are increasingly seeing offshore operations as well as offshore outsourcing, and outsourcing itself has become a major trend within businesses, to the point that we have organizations within particular industries where outsourcing is a default position, and that we have the emergence of what we call core competencies. That organizations identify what their core competencies are, what activities and business functions actually give them a competitive advantage, and anything outside of those core competencies, which does not give them a competitive advantage, is a candidate for outsourcing. So a good example of this will be Apple. So if you consider Apple as an organization and you consider what they actually do, well, Apple are primarily an organization which produces marketing material. They do carry out their own marketing. It's a core competency and a skill of theirs. And they're a design company. They design hardware and they design software. They typically are not famous for manufacturing. Almost all of Apple's manufacturing has long since been outsourced, and in this case, offshore outsourced. So they are not typically seen as a manufacturing company, which may surprise people because they associate Apple with physical products. But again, that's part of this idea of core competencies. You identify what gives you a competitive advantage, and anything which does not can be outsourced. We couple this with the with globalization as a phenomena which has continued to move forward in terms of its all pervasiveness, where now countries are developing specialisms themselves. So a particular confluence of labor specifics, of geographical location, of particular skill sets, resource availability, has allowed countries to really develop specialisms for particular activities. And offshoring as an activity is really an attempt to take advantage of that of the processes of globalization, producing specializations amongst countries in different parts of the world. So what we want to do now is just take a look at some of the factors involved in decision making around outsourcing and offshoring. So we'll tackle outsourcing first. So this is called typically just decision logic of outsourcing. So you have a particular activity or business function in mind, and you want to consider whether outsourcing this function to a third party would be feasible or beneficial. So we can start with the question, is this activity or business function of strategic importance? I.e., does it directly tie in to our organization's strategy? Is it part of the long-term vision for the organization? Is it something which is going to directly feed into the company's long-term planning? So if the activity is of strategic importance, we do want to make sure this activity remains in-house. We do not want to outsource it. And this would be for a few obvious reasons. Even though outsourcing relationships are governed by contracts, so you would have a contractual relationship with the outsourcee, it is still nonetheless a degree of control being given up around that activity. So if you identify something like manufacturing, so your in-house manufacturing arm as being part of the long-term strategic plan, then if you outsource manufacturing, you are inevitably going to give up a degree of control, no matter how well written or carefully monitored the contractual relationship is. As well as this, you would also give up the in-house knowledge around that activity or business function. So if manufacturing is particularly important to your organization, all of the knowledge which is locked up, the knowledge and experience which is locked up, would naturally diminish once that activity or that function has been outsourced. So you want to identify areas of strategic importance and then retain both control but also institutional knowledge and institutional experience around that activity or function. So for those reasons, we really do want to identify core competencies and areas of strategic importance and make sure that those remain within the organization and are not outsourced to a third party. Speaking of knowledge, the next question that we would want to ask ourselves is, does the company actually have specialized knowledge in this area? So whether that specialized knowledge directly leads to immediate operational performance improvements, so it has some kind of superior operations performance, or if it's just specialized knowledge which is not actively being exploited at the moment, it's all still leading to the same conclusion. If there is specialized knowledge, then that's at least potential competitive advantage for the organization, and any knowledge around an activity is going to go once that activity is outsourced. So this would be for two major reasons. Either you want the outsourcee, so the company you've contracted with to perform the activity or the business function, you want them to maintain things along the same lines, which means that you're actually giving them the specialized knowledge you have. So that specialized knowledge is no longer now within your own organization solely, but is actually being shared with third parties and organizations outside of your own. Or if you want to rely on the organization that you're outsourcing with, so you want to rely on your outsourcee's knowledge in that particular area, then the knowledge you've retained within your own organization has no purpose. Without any purpose, it's going to inevitably leave the company. So if we take, say, just accounting, if you have in-house specialist accountants which have specialized knowledge about the accounting practices or accounting requirements of your company, and now you're contracting with an accounting firm to actually do your accounts, there's no reason for you to have in-house accountants. So one of two things is either going to happen. Either those people are going to be made redundant, in which case that experience and knowledge leaves the organization, or they're going to be reassigned to different tasks, in which case, in a slower manner, eventually that experience and specialized knowledge will diminish because they're not actively engaged in that field. So generally speaking, if you have specialized knowledge, that needs to be kept in-house as well. You don't want to just outsource an activity where you have some kind of potential competitive advantage around. Now, the third question we would want to ask is your organization's operations performance superior in some way, shape, or form? So do you have a competitive advantage from your performance in this activity or this business function? This is relatively self-explanatory. If your performance in a particular activity or business function or operation is superior than some or most of your competitors, then by outsourcing you would be losing that performance advantage and therefore that competitive advantage. Now, not only that, but we also need to ask the fourth question is it likely that you would be able to improve your performance significantly? So in this case, if we're looking to outsource a particular activity, but it's likely that a investment in that activity or function would drastically or even significantly improve our performance, then that would be a better long-term investment than the shorter-term or short-term benefit, cost-saving benefit from outsourcing. Any performance enhancement from outsourcing, so let's say you're outsourcing to a specialist, you don't have a long-term benefit from that performance enhancement. As soon as your contract comes to an end or you stop outsourcing with that company, you would lose any performance optimization or benefit. But also you're not investing in long-term knowledge retention, knowledge generation, and experience within your own organization. So if you are able to improve your performance in some meaningful way, then that would be a better long-term benefit. So if the answer to all four of those questions is no, then it's likely that you can explore outsourcing this activity without too many significant structural drawbacks. Whereas an answer of yes to any of those questions in the decision logic would suggest that keeping that activity in-house would be better. Now, when I say that if the answer is no, then that activity likely can be outsourced without too many negative drawbacks, that's from the perspective of the organization. When it comes to the impact of outsourcing on the labor force and even on the customer base, the picture is far more mixed, and there's a lot of contestation around the impact of outsourcing on other stakeholders aside from just the organization itself. And that is well worth looking into in more detail. Now, the next or last area we're going to look at is the factors involved in offshoring decisions. Now, this can be largely broken down into just two major types. So when we're considering where to locate our activity, whether we're going to locate it domestically or internationally, we have supply side and demand side factors. Supply side factors have traditionally been the most important of the two, but particularly recently in the last 5 or so years, demand side factors are exerting more of an influence as well. So if we look at our traditional supply side factors, we have labor costs, land costs, energy, transportation costs, and community factors, of which most people would automatically look to label labor costs as the most important. And we see this if we think about common responses to a question such as why is the iPhone assembled in China? And the response is usually something along the lines of, well, labor is cheaper in China, so therefore the cost of assembly is cheaper. It's worth pointing out that labor costs are obviously important, and for certain types of industries or sectors, labor costs may actually be the largest cost involved in production or manufacturing. However, it's difficult or is important rather not to overstate the importance of labor costs. And in fact, if we examine what the supply side factors for smartphone assembly in China actually are, labor costs do form a part of it. Labor costs are cheaper than labor in, say, Western Europe or North America, but they're not the most, or it's not the cheapest labor for this kind of work. You will find areas with much cheaper labor costs than China. China actually, generally speaking, has rising wages and rapidly expanding middle class. So it doesn't represent the cheapest possible labor cost for this kind of manufacture and assembly. To understand the reasons, we have to look to things like education. It's a semi-skilled occupation. China has excellent primary and secondary education, particularly in technical fields, cuts down on the cost of training and education for organizations. If you place your facilities in places without access to that kind of education, its physical location is excellent, able to minimize distribution costs when you're shipping all around the world. You have the American markets across the Pacific. You have access to India and Africa, and then you also have access to Europe through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. So the location is excellent. The ability to find resources is very good as well. So rubber and tin and so on from Malaysia and Indonesia, the Philippines, access to oil and other resources from the Middle East. So its position geographically is excellent as well. So that would take off things like energy costs and transportation costs as well. So all of these things provide a factor. As well as these supply side factors, we also have our demand side factors. So here, looking at the labor skills which are needed, the suitability of the site, convenience for customers, and also what's increasingly important is the image that our location decisions have on our customers. This in particular has led to the phenomena known as reshoring, and we can see this in such as call centers. So India developed, so the south of India in particular, developed a specialization in technical support calls and call centers for a variety of reasons. Labor costs there are cheaper than Western Europe and North America. English is a native language. Technical education is excellent, and connectivity, so internet connectivity as well, is also excellent. So for those reasons, it became an international hub for English language in particular, call centers and technical helplines. However, there has been a rise in reshoring some of these functions and activities back to the UK. We see this with Sky, we see this with O2 as well. And that's in part down to the image that it presents to customers. So the UK has a complicated relationship with race, to say the least. Brexit is an example of how this really can explode out into the mainstream. So some companies have made the decision that these demand side factors have prompted a rethink about their location decisions, and some of these activities and functions have been brought back to the UK. So that's reshoring. So bringing an offshore activity back into the UK itself.